Booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm your host, Naomi. Our topic for this episode is Toni Morrison's Tar Baby. Our guest is Rhonda, whom I pledged a sorority with many years ago during our undergraduate education at Ouachita in Arkansas. Rhonda, welcome to the show.
Thank
Please
you.
tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Okay. I live in Arkansas still, and I have been a teacher for 25 years now, and that blows my mind. And I have taught everything from composition, world lit, speech and drama, and now I teach online. Well, I've taught online for the past 15 years, so that's pretty cool. And now I'm so happy to be teaching creative writing, contemporary lit, public speaking. I'm holding out for a Gothic monsters lit class next year, so hopefully. But yeah, that's who I am.
Before we begin our conversation, here's a brief overview of Tar Baby, Morrison's first novel set in the time period in which she wrote it. Published in 1981, Toni Morrison's Tar Baby is a lush, complex novel that moves between the Caribbean island of Ile de Chevaliers and the fast-paced streets of New York City. At its center are two protagonists from vastly different worlds. Jadine Childs, a Sorbonne-educated fashion model and protege of the wealthy Valerian Street, and Son, a penniless, charismatic drifter who secretly enters the Street family's estate. Their subsequent romance serves as a crucible for the book's exploration of identity, culture, and belonging. As Jadine and Son move from the tropical heat of the islands to the winter of the United States, they grapple with opposing views on what it means to be authentic and rooted. The narrative is celebrated for its evocative prose and its exploration of the tension between Western-educated and traditional folkways. Morrison further complicates the story by examining the intricate power dynamics between the streets, who are white and moneyed, and their longtime servants, Ondine and Sydney, who are black, while weaving African-American folklore and the personified Caribbean landscape into the narrative to heighten its dreamlike quality. Ultimately, Tar Baby functions as a brilliant examination of the masks people wear and the difficult choices involved in defining oneself outside of others' expectations. It remains a poignant study of the sacrifices made in the pursuit of both personal freedom and cultural connection. While the narrative explores the internal tensions of identity and heritage, the external response to the novel has often been defined by a desire to silence those very conversations. Toni Morrison is one of the most frequently challenged authors in American literature, and Tar Baby occupies a unique space in that history. Unlike her more commonly banned works, such as The Bluest Eye or Beloved, Tar Baby has faced less frequent but no less pointed opposition. Challenges to the novel typically center on its frank depictions of sexuality and its unflinching exploration of racial conflict and power dynamics. In several instances, school boards and libraries have seen requests for its removal due to what critics label as, quote, inappropriate language or explicit content, unquote, often serving as a proxy for discomfort with Morrison's rigorous interrogation of Western values and Black identities. The book's banning is often tied to a broader systemic effort to restrict access to literature that centers Black experiences and challenges established social hierarchies. Because the novel examines the complicated relationships between white employers and Black domestic workers, as well as the internal tensions within the Black community regarding class and education, it has been targeted by those who view its social critiques as subversive. Despite these attempts at censorship, Tar Baby remains a vital part of the literary canon, frequently defended by educators and free speech advocates as an essential study of the psychological and cultural costs of assimilation. So, Rhonda, what personal connection or specific theme led you to choose Tar Baby for our conversation? Why does this book resonate for you?
Well, first of all, I love Toni Morrison so much. And the first book I ever read of hers was Beloved. And I was just drawn in. And I think I've read all of her books. This one is quite different. Like you said, it's set in the same time period in which she wrote it. And this book resonates with me because it's all about identity and belonging, and to live in one world so much that it almost strips one's identity because one is not able to look and see, to give and take. So I really like that part. The characters are pulled in completely different directions by their class beliefs, by their backgrounds, and it's really kind of tragic because they want this connection, but they have tried to get the connection at all cost of everything else. I really think at its root, it's searching for who they are and their identity.
I had not read this novel. I've read a lot of Toni Morrison. I think now the only novel of hers that I have not read is Song of Solomon. I've read all the rest, and I was just fascinated by it because she did put it in a contemporary or a contemporaneous setting, which the only other book she does with that is God Bless the Child, I think, because Mercy and Home and all of those are set previously. Though I have to say, my first book that I read by Toni Morrison was Paradise, and
Okay.
it is still my favorite. And I keep waiting for someone to pick it so I can have it on the podcast, but I'll get there. Morrison sets the street estate L'Arbre de la Croix against a Caribbean landscape that seems to possess its own consciousness and memory. How does this haunting personified environment mirror the internal psychological states of characters like Jadine and Son as they struggle with their own sense of belonging?
Well, the island does feel almost alive. And there is, I think, especially for Jadine, because there's this whole thought of the swamp women. She feels that they are watching her and judging her for her assimilation. And to some extent, I think they're watching Son too, but Son doesn't care as much, I think, as Jadine does. And it's kind of an extension of the character's psychological, makeup, because Jadine is on this path. She is a fashion model. She is living in Paris, and Son's just trying to survive. It's got this idea of they're caught between two worlds. Jadine is in this world, but there's something that maybe she knows deep down that this is not exactly where she needs to be or what she needs to be doing. And the same with Son. He is so rooted in his cultural identity that he wants to change, I think, only for Jadine. But other than that, I think he's kind of okay. And I think he tends to ignore the supernatural that Jadine is really focused on.
They also talk about, besides the swamp women, the novel also talks about the, I guess, former slaves that are supposedly up in the mountains somewhere.
Blind horseman, yeah.
They're like these ghosts in the story. And I thought that that was really interesting. Obviously, Toni Morrison, she writes a lot of magical realism
Yeah.
into her story. So that was a part of it. But that was interesting for me as well as the swamp women. Jadine and Son represent two starkly opposing philosophies of Black identity. And I think you've already touched on this, but we're going to talk about it more. One rooted in Western cosmopolitanism and the other in traditional folk ways. Which character's argument for authenticity do you find more compelling? And how does their conflict reflect the broader tensions of the late 1970s when Morrison wrote and set this novel?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Jadine is not your typical African American woman that existed at this time. She is well educated. She is a fashion model. She's been on covers of magazines, which did not happen until like 1983, I think. I'm drawing a blank at the
Naomi
fashion.
Campbell.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Um, is living his life as he wants to live it. He knows his identity. He knows where he came from, and he is genuine. I more so than Jadine, even though because she has assimilated so much that she feels almost like she has become white because she's got the streets funding her education. She comes and she dines with them, which I thought was really interesting because her aunt and uncle are their servants, and yet she dines with them. If you take when this was written, that was just a little, I don't know, going against the grain of what was going on at that time. So I think that as far as authenticity, I would slightly lean toward Son being his most authentic self because he just seems to be unwavering in who he is.
Son, you said he was more rooted, and I think that's very accurate because he's from a small black town, predominantly black town in Florida, very rural, probably not as up to date as it could have been in 1979 when the novel is set. He's much more rooted in that community, and it doesn't bother him to go back to that community and see his relatives. And of course, he knows everyone in town because it's small like that. But Jadine does not enjoy her time with him there. You know, she actually feels much more comfortable in a way when she's in Paris. But I also thought that that was very interesting too, just based on authors like James Baldwin have said about being an expatriate in Europe when
Mhm.
you are a Black American,
It's
that there's
easier.
kind of a relief
Yes,
that their skin color is not always the first thing that other people see or
absolutely.
comment on or behave toward them. And so she's had this experience that, you know, it is more cosmopolitan and she does like New York City. And of course, I think New York City was much more liberal in some ways at that time around Black identity than maybe the streets were in their hoity toity Philadelphia social circles that they came from before they moved to the island. Well, and to go back to what we've already touched on before, throughout the novel, Morrison weaves in the mythic presence of the swamp women and the legendary blind horsemen of the hills. In what ways do these supernatural elements serve as a silent jury, commenting on the modern material choices the characters face as they move between the island and the mainland?
I believe that Jadine felt their presence more than Son did. However, I think Son does feel their presence in that even though he's rooted in his life, he is a little rootless because he jumped ship. He killed his wife. So he's basically a fugitive. So he does feel that presence. But I think Jadine feels it more because it's almost like she's turning her back on who she is and what she has become because she lost her mother very young. And at one point, Onadine tells her that you didn't have a mother to teach you, basically. And so maybe that's part of the reason that she looks at these swamp women almost as like her spiritual guides, her mother figure. I really feel like Jadine deep down feels like she's letting them down because of the life she has chosen, but not to the extent that she's ready to give it up because that's what she's chosen. She was going to marry a white man. And the thing that she was so enthralled with was the sealskin coat because that was almost like that's the height of epitome. This is what I have risen to. But I do think it's interesting going back when she was in Paris and she saw the African woman dressed in yellow and the African woman spit at her, and that bothered her. So I feel like the African woman in Paris is almost tied in with the swamp women in that they do not approve of her. They're judging her.
I think Jadine felt their presence a little more menacingly
Yes.
than Sun did, even though maybe that's where her connection is, that she feels them sort of surveilling her or judging her. And Sun does not feel that they're doing that to him, even though they might be there. To change this topic a little bit, the relationship between the wealthy streets and their longtime staff, Sydney and Ondine, it goes far beyond a simple employer-employee dynamic, evolving into a tangled web of shared secrets and resentment. How do these intricate power dynamics complicate our understanding of loyalty versus the cold realities of economic survival?
Sydney and Ondine are loyal, but it's a loyalty built out of necessity. They have to be there to work, and there is resentment. Ondine knew the secret that Margaret was causing her child harm. She resented this. Sydney is taking care of Valerian, but it's almost like he doesn't have any dignity. And I also found it so interesting that they are in this position that they almost lord it over all of the other Black people in the village because they call Gideon Yardman. That his identity is just the man who works in the yard. So yes, there is loyalty, but I think it's loyalty built on need. They have to have their job, so therefore there has to be a little bit of loyalty to keep this. And there is so much resentment built up in Ondine that she kind of snaps when they have the Christmas meal. And you really get the feeling that that's the first time they've ever sat down and had a meal with the streets. That was a really integral point where it all came to a head, and it's like they're not that loyal. They're just here because they have to be. What other option do I have?
It's out of economic necessity because Sydney at one point says, "We don't have any other savings. We have to keep working for these people. And eventually, if we're going to retire, it seems like they're going to have to retire and the streets would have to provide a pension for them. Otherwise, how are they going to live?" So they've kind of hitched their wagon to the streets, as it were, even though Ondine knows that Margaret was pinching their son when he was a baby, and Ondine tried to protect him. And now, of course, their son is mostly estranged. And to Ondine, this is not mysterious at all. Margaret's kind of delusional that he's going to come for this Christmas dinner. And when Ondine and Sydney are supposed to sit down for this Christmas dinner, it is the weirdest dynamic because Jadine feels very much at home because she's been eating meals with Valerian and Margaret all along as Margaret's assistant or what have you. But for Ondine and Sydney, who've always been told they're part of the family, but never actually been treated like they're part of the family, this is a very awkward situation.
Yes.
And so that's when all these secrets come out and everything comes to kind of this head, as it were.
You have Son sitting there too, though. Add him in the mix. And it was so bizarre that Valerian just said, "Come on in." You've got a man hiding in his wife's closet. And I think he did that just to poke at Margaret, honestly. But I did find it so interesting, and I'm getting off topic just a minute, but this is Toni Morrison. It must have been said like 5, 6, 7 times, but I wasn't following the women. I wasn't following the women. Son constantly, but I was not following. And then he said, well, maybe I was following them, because of course Margaret was terrified because he's a large, black man in my closet. And she even said he looked like a gorilla. And Jadine was like, okay. But she even supplied Margaret with a racial slur, which she thought was better than her calling him a gorilla. So you've got all these dynamics that just are crazy when they come to a head on this Christmas dinner. And it's one of the best scenes I swear I've read lately in a book. It's just wonderful because I had read this book a long time ago and I had to reread it. And I was like, yeah, this is why I love Toni Morrison.
Also, in the aftermath of that, Jadine, they called her Jade sometimes.
Jade, yeah.
She and Son leave, but Sydney and Ondine, they go back to being the servants as though none of this stuff
Nothing
had ever
happened.
happened. Yeah, it was a little crazy. So, in the Joel Chandler Harris version of the folktale Brer Fox, he uses the tar baby as a trap for Brer Rabbit. But Morrison reclaims this imagery through her grandmother's telling, which she relates in the prologue of the story, where a farmer tosses the rabbit into the briar patch. Given that Brer Rabbit is a classic trickster figure who relies on his wits to escape certain doom, who in this novel serves as the ultimate trickster? And does the tar baby in this story act as a snare set by those in power or as a tool for the characters to outfox the social traps laid for them?
I think in this particular setting, trickster role shifts on the situation. I do think it's very interesting that Morrison had the tar baby as a female. And I think it has less to do with trickster and trapping, and it has more to do with recognizing the trap in the first place. You could say that Jadine had tricked Son, and you could also say that Son had tricked Jadine, but I think it shifts depending on where they're at the time. I think both of them are not completely honest with each other. There is some trickery with both of them, but I do think it shifts depending on the situation. They have to recognize the trap. And that's the main takeaway. They're very aware to some extent of what they're doing. It's not so much them getting tricked as, hey, this is a trap, but we're going for it anyway.
At various points, I felt like Jadine was the tar baby, and there's actually some very specific references in Jadine's Internally Speaking, where she talks about a tar baby. In some ways, she's a tar baby for Son, and in other ways, he's the tar baby for her. Is Jadine Brer Rabbit because she's kind of outfoxing the streets. They give her all this money. They've introduced her to a better life. And so she's able to take advantage of that and parlay it into an education and this fantastic career and everything. But Son is also a trickster character for the streets as well. Like you said, he's a big black guy hiding in the lady of the
closet.
house's closet, which under other circumstances, people
Somebody
would
would have
call
shot
the
him.
police.
Yeah.
Yeah. He would be lynched or shot or
Yeah.
called the police at a minimum. But he also gets himself invited to dinner. But I think he's also tricking Jadine too into this with a promise that
he's
he will go
going to-
with her. But when it comes down to it and they go back home, she leaves and he's like, I'll catch up with you in a couple days. I just want to see this person coming in. And months later, he's still not in New York City. And she's like, screw this. I'm going to Paris.
Yep. Yep.
I think you're right that the trickster character and the tar baby character, they do move around, though it's hard to say who is setting a trap for
For
whom
who?
and who actually escapes it. I don't know if any of them actually escape it.
I don't think they do. I think they're both caught because neither one at the end are very happy.
Right.
And neither is Ondine and Sydney. Jadine kind of turns on them at the end. It's Toni Morrison. There are so many things to think and delve into her books. Her prose is so freaking magical. I remember just being in mourning when she passed away. And I
I
can't
know.
believe it's been that long, like 7 years. And her prose is just magical. Like one phrase she kept using over and over is blue as if it's a boy blue eye or something to that extent, talking about Margaret's eyes. And I just find patterns and things like that just so amazing. And I'm like, I want to write books like this.
Toni Morrison wanted you to write books like that too, or at least if those were the books she wanted to read, she wanted you to write them.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So, what central idea or lingering question do you want our listeners to hold on to after they finish the pages of this novel?
It leaves us with the question of, is it fully possible to belong only in one world and to retain our identity? I think you have to move between worlds to know who you really are. Jadine was adamant that she lived this Western assimilated world. And I think in doing so, she lost a sense of who she was. Son wanted to live in Elo, and he wanted that connectedness to his heritage, to his culture. But in doing so, he lost part of his identity. I think it's so important that we not lock ourselves into one world and one world only, because I think in doing so, we lose part of ourselves.
I love that. Thank you so much
You're
for coming
welcome.
on to Booked and Banned and exposing me to Tar Baby, which I had not read before, like I said. Our next episode will be a discussion of City of Thieves by David Benioff. Thank you for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.